Got it.
Got it.
All right. Excellent. Well, I'm delighted to be here talking with you today, Aaron.
Leslie, I'm delighted to be here talking with you. It's so nice to have had a chance to speak with you recently about about what we're seeing in the profession of counseling.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to meet you when I first met you. I guess it's been a couple of years ago now through CTA, and just to hear your very reasonable and very balanced perspective on all these things. And you've had a lot of events that have occurred since then,
Yeah, that's
and
right.
and observations to share about those events.
Yeah, well,
So,
I was very interested in what your experiences at Antioch were. And I've been very worried about the politicization of therapy and
mhm,
and the use of the therapeutic alliance uh, to meet political ends that the client other under other in other circumstances, might not agree to, but in their state of vulnerability, they might, agree to view themselves in politicized ways because their ego strength is lower. They're in a great deal of psychological pain, and
mhm,
maybe are coping with confusion about their own identity and so forth. And
mhm,
I'm very worried about where counselor training is heading. And I'm
mhm.
very worried about the way that's beginning to manifest in actual counseling sessions. And so I was hoping to talk with you about some of these issues, particularly after I heard about the experiences that you've had at Antioch. I was
Mhm.
particularly interested in the fact that you had to sign a document
Mhm.
that affirmed a certain set of beliefs, and that parallels what I've been seeing as I go back and I look at uh, the trends of how political prisoners have been made to come around to a certain way of thinking. It trends very close to some of what I've been
Mhm.
reading about, and so I wanted to reach out and talk with you about what your experiences were. So you had to sign something.
Yes, yes. And I forgot to hit the record button, so I'm hitting record now. We are live, but I'm also going to record this so I can put it on. So you'll see
Okay.
that little notification come up. I
Yeah.
did, and um, yes, what you're talking about there with your concerns around the politicization of the therapy process is something that is incredibly alarming to me, and is what motivated me to start talking about this in a more public way.
Mhm.
It's an exploitation of a very vulnerable time.
Yeah.
It's a time when a person could be more suggestible, and definitely is trying to put trust in another person to help them through what, the difficulties of life. And so to co-opt that space for the indoctrination of some set of ideological principles is just, it's a really dirty project. And I thank you for putting it so well. And just for anybody who has not already come across you, I want to introduce you really quick, and then I'll read you the civility pledge that I was told
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
sign.
That you were asked to sign.
Mhm.
Sure.
Yeah, so Aaron Kinsvatter, Dr. Aaron Kinsvatter, I'm speaking with today, is a former professor of counselor education. He left his tenured position to start a private practice in Burlington, Vermont. And we're speaking today because he's wanting to discuss these shared experiences of being my experience of being encouraged to politicize therapy in my training program, and his concerns around these same things. And so this is just a really wonderful opportunity to have a dialogue around some of these things.
Yeah.
And so
So the
you brought up,
civility pledge, yeah. What
yeah,
I
you brought
mean,
up the civility
on the
pledge.
surface, that's
Mhm.
who wouldn't have a problem with signing a civility pledge, right? But
Right. Yeah.
then you
Yeah.
find out, I suspect something is in it that
Yeah. And that links really well with something else that we wanted to talk about, which is this obfuscation of language and this
yeah.
like sort of this fancy gloss that we've got over everything with this lovely flowery DEI language that how could you
Oh
ever object
gosh.
to things like
Right.
anti-racism, et cetera, et cetera. But yes, this was called a civility pledge. At some point, I believe during 2020, Antioch started to incorporate this language into their syllabi for the CMHC, the clinical mental health counseling program that I was attending. I did not notice it because I just wasn't in the habit of combing over my syllabi
Hmm.
until a required course, a professor required as our first assignment that we go into our discussion forum and post that we agreed to this pledge. So I went in and read the language and I said, I can't agree with this. And I'll read it in just a second. I'll read it out loud. And I dropped the class at that point because I knew that my only other option was to post publicly that I didn't agree with it. And
Yeah.
that wasn't something I was prepared to do because of
Yes. Now,
this.
interesting.
Mhm,
Okay, so
mhm,
already the manipulation has started,
mhm,
right? But let's
mhm.
in a couple of ways the manipulation has already started. But
Right,
let's
right.
hear like I'm sure, but I'm sure the civility pledge just means that you will express yourself honestly
Mhm.
and with manners, right?
Well, that they do include that. So the
Yeah.
second half of the civility pledge, I'm
Oh,
all
there's a
for.
second half. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but it was the first part that I didn't agree with, and
Yeah.
so it says I acknowledge that racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, ableism, ageism, nativism, and other forms of interpersonal and institutionalized forms of oppression exist. And again, that second forms is in there. It's not my
Yeah.
heading. I will do my best to better understand my own privileged and marginalized identities and the power that these afford me. And so then the next part is just about like academic honesty. And
Yeah.
if you feel upset about something, you'll talk to the professor. So it's all good stuff at the end. But that first part, I thought, I can sort of massage this to be something that I can agree with. I
Yeah.
can. I
Yeah.
don't, it's not that I don't think that those forms of oppression
Right.
exist. I think
Yeah.
people discriminate against each other for all kinds of
Sure they
reasons.
do. Sure
And
they do.
I'm not objecting to those on principle. What I'm objecting to is the compelled language.
Right.
And the part that I couldn't really massage to fit my worldview was the part about identities. I don't
Yeah.
agree that I have privileged and marginalized
Right.
identities. I don't agree with the intersectional
Right.
framework of defining a human based on a series of group identities. I have an identity, and my identity is made up of different facets of my being, but
Mm.
I don't have privileged and marginalized identities, and I just refuse to go along with that. And I just felt like there's a line in the sand, and maybe
Yeah.
I'll look silly if I don't step over it, but I'm just going to have to choose a place, and this is where I'm going to choose. I'm
Yeah.
not
Well,
going.
and so but you're put into a position too where you're
Mhm,
going to have to publicly agree to this or not. And
mhm,
I mean,
mhm.
do you have a sense of like why that was, why you would need to publicly agree to it or say that you wouldn't? Why public? Like, why not just let you like click a box or something?
Yeah, I think it's probably because, you know, uh, in thought reform, the more
Yeah,
you confess,
that's right.
the closer you come to the belief system. So
Right.
if I say I agree with this, it's
Right.
like the cognitive dissonance won't allow me to say that and also disagree with it. So I'm much more likely to then start to align with it. I think it's a way to increase adherence.
Yeah, it is. I think there are both. I think there are interesting things going on from a psychological perspective here,
Mhm, mhm,
both interpersonally, intrapersonally, and then from a group perspective.
mhm,
Because I think another sort of way that so first let's just acknowledge that there you're having to agree. We would both agree. We're both practitioners. I know I certainly in the course of my work, have addressed issues of racism. I have addressed issues of homophobia with clients. Like that stuff is out there, and it, you know, I think that kind of like overt, old school, if you will, racism, it is alive and well, and it probably will be as long as there are people who are sort of desperately lonely and unhappy, that they tend to channel those energies into a racialization. So we know that that does occur. But what they've done is they have used that sort of traditional sense of racism and homophobia and all the other things that are in there that occur, that nobody would have any problem acknowledging, but they've also added something, which is sort of the intersectional piece. And that's sort of an old sort of Maoist trick. And I'm not sure that that there's some evil genius saying, let's study Mao and then repeat that, but it is a very much divide and conquer kind of mentality. I think what's also really interesting is that they are beginning to establish a group dynamic. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about how this works in counselor training programs is people seem to know that are these, social justice type counselor educators. They seem to understand very well how to use the pressure of groups to get ideological compliance. And it's really kind of creepy how it starts, because a lot of times it does start with what sounds like a really open invitation. So in your case, it was sort of like a civility pledge. In other cases, you tend to, and maybe I would be curious if this sounds familiar to you, but you come into like your, your intersectionality class or whatever, and you hear a speech that's something like, I just want to let you know that you are, you're accepted here. All ideas are welcome. We don't want to be hurtful. Wherever you're at is okay. Something like that. Something they begin with sort of a Rogerian unconditional positive regard. But then along the way, there are these little things that you agree to, and they make sure that you agree to it publicly. And what they're trying to do is form a group cohesiveness, because once they do that, the group will generally begin by being very interested in each other and very open, and it will be characterized initially by unconditional positive regard. In your case, there was a condition placed early, which is the condition is you need to sign this civility pledge, which involves, that you affirm a political ideology in order to take this class. But a lot of times it starts with sort of, you don't have to make a commitment ahead of time, because the point is to provide a sense of safety and warmth, and to get people comfortable, and to begin to make them malleable, to begin to make them want to please each other.
I think this is a really great outline that you're describing about how it's sort of a softening you up. Like
It is a
sort of,
softening you up.
like you're giving, you're kind of sugarcoating this thing. And
Right.
once somebody's already holding your hand and walking along the path with you, you can introduce some elements that might be a little bit harder to swallow if you were hit with those up front. But
Yeah.
since you're already walking down the path, you'll go ahead and accept these, and it's a little easier. And
Well,
I will say that
yeah.
the civility pledge, this was, I don't know if this is planned out by Antioch, but this was in like a much later part of my coursework, near the end of it. So they introduced this in like a class that already had many prerequisites before you could get to it. And so it was very much as you describe, in line with what you're describing. It wasn't hit right out of the gates with this kind of thing. And I don't know if they've changed their policy to where now they're doing that, but it goes in line with what you're describing.
Well, if they haven't changed their policy, I wouldn't be surprised. I think there's some really frightening things. But let me just, I mean, we've got a lot to talk about, but let's rehash what we've talked about so far, which is essentially, that you're introduced to this gradually, and they feed you the soft stuff first. And so that you're walking down the path, but you're not walking down the path alone, are you? You're walking down the path with, maybe the other group members and with the professor, and you feel okay there because you're experiencing unconditional positive regard. But then something weird begins to happen. And that is that slowly, gradually, conditions are placed on the regard, and now what happens, this is where the group becomes a very powerful tool to gain ideological compliance, because we've already said, okay, we're going to, this group is going to solidify around this civility pledge, which says lots of nice stuff, and you're going to agree to sort of follow a Maoist model of identity and, formation or whatever. So what happens is if the group begins to form around that, then anyone who begins to push back against that or not go along with that will then have to face the consequence of being abandoned by the group and possibly by the professor. So there's a very subtle abandonment threat, and it's sort of part of that conditional positive regard that starts to happen. Like, if you don't go along with this, if you're not civil, well, there must be something deeply wrong with you. And then then the pressure to comply with with this little thing that initially you were uncomfortable with, but you just kind of went along. The stakes are now much greater because you formed these relationships that mean something to you now, that they're important to you, and to stand up to that little thing that doesn't suit you very well, or that doesn't go along with you very well, that becomes much harder. And even as that's becoming much harder, the demands for the suspension of disbelief, to not introduce inconvenient questions about the morality of ethics of what's being taught, becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. So we move from unconditional positive regard to gradually conditional positive regard. And then what also happens simultaneously is, and this is what's really creepy about this. I mean, anyone who's got mental health training will be familiar with the behavioral mechanism of negative reinforcement. That it's, negative reinforcement, for people who are watching who might not know, is it's just an incredibly powerful behavioral mechanism that can have a major impact on how people behave. And essentially, negative reinforcement is escape behavior. And it's the mechanism behind phobias that can keep people restricting their lives. Like someone with claustrophobia may not go on the highway because they can't stand to have their seatbelt on, or someone who has agoraphobia might not go to the grocery store because they're having a panic attack. So in each of those cases, people are escaping something that's uncomfortable, and they're circumscribing their lives to do it. What happens in these so-called DEI trainings is, or intersectionality classes or DEI classes or whatever, is there's a group process that starts where the relationships matter to you, and then conditions are placed where you have to go along with these ideas or be on the out group. But also, in order to adopt these ideas, the group begins to place a great amount of pressure. The instructor, might say that, a good grade is based on your compliance with, that you might have to essentially repeat what the professor wants you to think. And the group members will sort of begin to gang up on you. And what's going on there is the difference between negative reinforcement, by the way, and punishment is that punishment will stop a behavior. Reinforcement always encourages a behavior. And when the group puts pressure on a student and the professor puts pressure on a student, what that pressure is negative reinforcement. And negative reinforcement to do what? Comply with the ideas that were hinted at the beginning. So you're placed in this situation where there is constant pressure on you, but there's always a little escape hatch that you can choose to go through at any time. And so what is the escape hatch? Compliance. And it's a hugely powerful behavioral mechanism. If you just comply, the pressure will stop. We will like you again, as long as you stay in line with the conditions that we have set out. Does that sound familiar to you?
It very much does. It's a really great way to sort of organize that phenomenon. I've got some loud lawnmowers outside, so I've muted myself on and off. Can you hear them?
Okay, I can't hear them, but
sorry. They picked the most inconvenient
what's really
time.
creepy is what I've just described to you. It was described by an author by the name of Merleau, who wrote. He was writing about the treatment of political prisoners and how do you get what you want with a political prisoner is you don't want to just punish them. You want to change their belief system so it matches yours. And what I've just described to you is very much in line with what Merleau thought. And the title of his book, by the way, is called The Rape of the Mind. And this, it's really scary when you go back and you read a book like this and say, wow, that sounds a lot like what's going on in intersectionality class. Boy, that sounds a lot like what I'm hearing from people. That's really creepy. And part of the process too is agreements to little things, getting you to agree a little bit at a time. There's also sort of an atmosphere of confession. And I don't know if you might have run into this or not, but it's interesting in sort of how the critical social justice literature, the use of confession comes up a lot. And
it really does, yeah.
Well, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think one of the things that confession does is if you have to confess that you have gone against something, just say, for example, that I am religious and I have sins and I have to confess those sins. What that does is it sort of, on a psychological level, it elevates the importance of the doctrine to which I have violated by sinning. And so what I think by getting people to confess, what they're doing is it's part of it's about getting a person to sort of, I don't know if the word is supplicate themselves to the material, but it's also about elevating the status of the material as something sacred that one must sort of confess to when one has, gone astray from it. And so I think that's part of it. I also think that in situations like what we're talking about, confession becomes a way of achieving status. It becomes a way of witnessing what the group or what the, the professor, what the counselor favors. Like if you can just begin to sort of confess, then you start to get lots of positive reinforcement. The conditions on regard don't go away, but you do start to, you gain status by confessing. And this is a hugely powerful method of psychological manipulation.
Well, it's really interesting that it also sort of taps into, it's kind of a perversion of the value of courage, because the person who stands up and confesses is demonstrating sort of a courageous willingness to, demonstrating bravery, because this is apparently something bad. You don't want to confess this, but it's within a caged system where you know that you're going to be rewarded for it. So it sort of turns that whole value on its head, but you still get the group credit. You get credit. And so people want to, it demonstrates something that then other people want to emulate. And so it's
a faux bravery. And it's, it's like a faux virtue. But, I don't know. I'm just thinking about what we've talked about so far. And it's like, well, so there are these psychological pressures and these, there's this process of negative reinforcement that is used to gain ideological compliance. And that's how you're trained as a counselor to approach these issues in therapy. Like this is not just, these classes are not like, they're not exact. Too often they're very much like therapy for, the counseling students, which in and of itself is extremely troubling. But remember, all these trainings are ultimately to train people to work with individuals. And that's where this gets really, really scary. Because I think what we're defining here is an extremely unhealthy process.
Oh, yes.
And it's a very subtle and powerful form of manipulation. And this is training counselors to do what? And it's
perpetuate
perpetuate this in the therapy room. And it's really scary to me, the degree to which that is beginning to come out.
Well, something you just said, I wanted to pick up on. You said that these classes end up being something like therapy for the counseling students. And you talked about that being unhealthy. And I wanted to just pause on that, because this was something that was explicitly discussed at Antioch, that this would be like you were basically, they even talked about it at the orientation that I went to for the program. This is going to be like doing 3 years of intense therapy for you. And so they talked about this at the beginning of a lot of the courses, especially during the first semester or two, that this is like, you've got to do the work. This is going to come out of you. And I recognize that that's going to be a part of the process of learning a lot of this, is that you're learning how to apply different pattern analysis, not only outwardly, but also inwardly. And so, yes, that's going to be a byproduct. But something that I thought was particularly interesting in my experience with the multicultural perspectives course that I've spent some time talking about on this channel in some earlier videos, which was the most concentrated and difficult social justice training of the program for me. This professor went out of her way to say she was not, that she painted it as if I had been asking her to be my therapist by talking about my perspective and how it, based on my experiences and my perspective and my analysis, I disagreed with the CRT that she was teaching. She framed this as me looking for mental health therapy through the program, and my first grievance that I went through with Antioch was over the fact that in my grade, we did narrative evaluations rather than like numerical or letter grades.
Yeah.
My narrative evaluation was this student needs to go to counseling to get over her racial issues, and she tried to use this course as a way to to get free therapy or whatever it was. It was so, she said it
I think
more
that's called
eloquently.
progression. I think that's called I think that's called projection. Oh man.
Well, yeah, I do too. But it's interesting that, that was like, it was like this push pull of just that very concept that you're talking about. And so I just wanted to pause on that and ask you to talk a little bit more about that.
No, I mean, let's look at the process of what happened. So you have a personality that is a strong one, and no one is going to, you're too ethical to lightly sign a piece of paper.
Mhm.
And frankly, in my opinion, the profession really has a lot to learn from people like you. People are way too quick to give into that kind of pressure, to the detriment of the very people that they're trying to help. But you're for this professor, you're a hard nut to crack, because you will not comply. And it's not that you didn't feel the pressures that were in the class. But your personality is sort of stable enough that you don't give into it. So now, what is her option? Because now you are interfering with the way that this process works. And that creates a great deal of anxiety in the system when people start asking questions and raising ethical and moral objections to this material that people like your professor, I've not yet, and I've really looked, I have not heard solid answers to the ethical and moral concerns around the politicization of therapy. And I've really looked. And so I don't think that person could answer to a student who just wasn't buying it. I think they've got zero mechanisms for working with a student like you.
You're right.
And so
this professor actually cried in class when I,
of course, this professor cried.
when I brought it up. Yeah. So, and she actually cried and talked about her emotional labor.
Yeah, boo-hoo. Yeah, yeah. What that's called is emotional blackmail, and anyone who is trying to use those kind of tactics has no business being in the front of a classroom, none whatsoever. Because what she was trying to do, again, is to sort of paint you as the bad guy, and and if she's letting it get to her to that point, then she clearly has boundary problems. But in addition to that, you're being punished. Reinforcement no longer works. We cannot get Leslie to comply. We've tried, we've tried negative reinforcement. We've tried positive reinforcement. Reinforcement doesn't work. Now we're going to punish her. And punishment is a way to stop behavior. What are we going to try to get her to stop doing? Stop objecting, stop being
questioning
rude,
it. Yeah.
Stop asking these questions. Stop raising these points. And so she essentially says, you're crazy. You need therapy. And that's just gross. Again, like what is a student to take from an experience like this when they go out and work with people who are in a great deal of mental distress? What is a student to take from this kind of behavior and treatment when they're entering a school to work with very young children, say? Like what lessons are being instilled into counselors who are going to be working with vulnerable?
Yeah, it's bullying. It's not healthy at all. It's incredibly dysfunctional.
It is incredibly dysfunctional. I would like to take some time, if folks would mind, if you would mind, Leslie, I'd like to illustrate how this is playing out right now. if people bear with me, I'd like to read a couple of paragraphs from an article I found, or that I really found really alarming on this, and it's called "How to Talk to White Clients About Race or
Oh my
Racism,"
gosh. Okay,
or
yeah, please
something like
do.
that. Yeah, this is,
Please do.
and anyone who wants to, this article's free. It's out there. So, how to talk to your white clients about race.
Yeah, if you
And
want
I
to
just,
find a link and send it to me, I can put it under
yeah,
like
I will.
in the
Yeah, we can
notes.
put that
Yeah.
into our thing. I did want to just touch on the issue of whiteness and so forth, because I think some people get nervous sometimes, to see someone like me to say, hey, I think whiteness is like a really bad idea. I think it's,
Mhm.
I think it's gross, and I think it's filthy, and I think that's not an all legitimate way of like looking at the world, and please don't do that.
Mhm.
And some people look at that and they get uncomfortable, because the only tools that they have to like understand that are, oh, we don't like, we don't like it when you connect social ills with whiteness, um, be, because the only way we can then understand that is by saying, oh, you must like really revel in your whiteness. You must be a white
Mhm. Mhm.
supremacist or something
Mhm.
like that. And the point that people miss is, well, first of all, that is gross and it's no fun, but like, I'm not concerned about me.
Mhm.
That once you like racialize, um, you take a problem in society and then you attribute that problem to a particular race. I mean, we've read that book before.
Mhm.
And it's like people need to remember what their grandfathers taught them. Like,
Mhm.
what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
Mhm.
And if these, I don't know, maybe well-meaning people, I'm starting to doubt that increasingly, but like if they, the American School Counseling Association, for example, has endorsed Kendi, who talks about
Mhm.
these
Mhm.
issues.
Mhm.
And if they've reached into the depths of their wisdom, and the best that they can bring out is to say, this is really, it's the problem of people of a particular race that ought to work
Mhm.
really well.
Mhm. Mhm.
What they are not paying attention to is where that goes, that if you
Mhm.
start to racialize that conversation, then you've said that these conversations are best racialized. And there are people, if they feel threatened or devalued, who will begin to say, hey, okay, if we're going
Mhm.
to play the race blame game, let's do it. And
Mhm.
we're already so hardwired to do that,
Mhm.
that it's really a very, very bad idea.
Mhm.
And it's a filthy idea to begin to racialize
It's
these. It's just gross.
extremely reductive, and it just goes ugly places. It just calls to people to uh, use very simplistic, judgmental thinking that
Yeah.
erases so much of what it means to be a person.
Yeah. Well,
And
and then I'm sure that, so I'm going to read from this article that's
Mhm.
called "How to Talk to Your White Clients About Race." But I'm sure that the person who wrote this, or people who think like this author, also have ideas about how to talk to Black clients about race. And
Mhm.
you've started to hear
Mhm.
issues like, Black people who are anti-Black, and you started to hear about I can't even remember what the term, some dumb term like multi-ethnic whiteness or
Oh,
multiracial whiteness. It was essentially
yeah,
saying that you can be white even if you're Black. Like, it's
yeah.
just,
Being a
a
black
gross.
white supremacist because you've
Yeah, just,
internalized white supremacy.
just,
And yeah, yeah.
just this nonsense.
Well,
And it's
and
like,
it's the Kafka trap. It's like,
yeah,
oh, you're just denying this because you really are this. It's like
right.
you of course you're denying it because of your
Right.
white supremacy. Oh, I'm not white. Sorry. And then
Yeah.
you've got internalized white supremacy. And yeah.
Well, and it's also useless because I think I'm getting this guy's name right. He should be awarded a presidential medal. But I was saying earlier that I really think that racism. And I know like the social justice types are going to say, oh, that kind of racism isn't what we're talking about. We're talking about structural racism.
Mm.
But I think actual honest to God racism and homophobia, which you and I see all the time,
Mm.
in our practices, not that our clients are that way, but that issues like that come up,
They're
right?
real issues. Yeah.
Yeah, real clients come in who have, been discriminated against all the time. And, but I really get the sense in hearing about like the people who do actually hold these, racialized views and so forth. They're just so desperately lonely. And these ideas about whiteness and whatever else are not going to do anything to fix this situation. They're only going to make them more isolated. I guess the object that I will hold up is the work of Daryl Davies, I believe his name is. And this is a person he's a Black man, but he's reached out to the heads of the Ku Klux Klan and has befriended them. And I have to go back and look at this, but dozens of these people have given Daryl Davies their hoods. They just,
because he's looking at the underlying issues that might lead to the symptoms of racism.
He's being a friend, and he's connecting to people on a very human level. And I'm not saying that's easy for him, but what I am saying is that what he's demonstrating for us is this is not the time to start moralizing to people.
So this is interesting because this Mr. Davies, he is seeing the racist as a person versus social justice, which sees the person as the racist or the ism or whatever.
Yeah,
so he's looking at this and he's saying, here's this one part of you, but I think that there's more of you, and I think we can draw that out and find something richer. And it's the absolute inversion of what social justice is doing.
It is, because what Daryl Davies is doing, and I do hope I'm getting his name right. I meant to review his work, but I've been a fan of what he's been doing for a long time. But he's taking a liberal humanist perspective. He's like taking an actual Rogerian perspective, and he's showing that works. And I feel like we all knew that until 5 minutes ago, that what we could do if we really wanted to do something about racism and homophobia and so forth, is like we could, as counselors, and I don't know if this is really the counselor's job, but say maybe a school counselor, you could, instead of like going around saying you're either a racist or an anti-racist, there's nothing in between. What you could be doing instead of that is trying to forge relationships between people who differ and show people what it's like to both give and receive unconditional positive regard. And I do not understand how or why that got lost. I guess I have some ideas that I'd like to share before we're done here, but
yeah,
I would like to, and I know this might run just a little bit long, but I would like to like bring this around to like what's actually happening in the counseling rooms. Like if you were to take this perspective that like a lot of these, we talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and those words, like in practice, it's almost if you invert them, that's how they actually play out. It's like diversity means conformity, inclusion means exclusion. That if you think something harmful, then you don't belong. Kind of like you're not going along, so you don't belong.
Well, and equity means unequal treatment.
Equity means discrimination. But it's like that's how language works in social justice. And maybe there's, if you want to, maybe we'll talk again a little more detail about the language games that are played and why it's so hard to argue with someone like your professor and talk about what these people are doing. But here's from this article. So I think the point that I was wanting to make is this article is about how to talk to white clients about race, but this is not a concern for white people. This is a concern about the racialization, the politicization and the racialization of psychotherapy.
So this is the using the opportunity to sit with one client in order to benefit a
Right.
different person that's not sitting in front of you. Okay.
Or even worse, a
Okay.
group of people, like
Okay.
where you say, and the author says this in this article, it's kind of like you have to take into account not just the needs of the individual sitting across from you. You need to take into account the needs of sort of like,
It's like this public health argument.
yeah, it's like
Yeah.
of marginalized groups.
Yeah. And this is
And
somehow still called therapy and counseling. But
yeah, which
okay.
it really like I think one of the things that needs to happen is people who don't buy into this are really going to have to find a way to distinguish themselves from people who do buy into it.
Yeah, I agree.
But
Yeah.
I'm jumping ahead. But this guy presents, or I don't know if it's a guy or girl or whatever, but
Okay.
this person presents a 5-step model on. He has a case vignette in which a person who is a traditional liberal, who is interested in equality, comes to therapy, and throughout this article, the author sort of rails against traditional liberalism as being a racist perspective, because from an anti-racist perspective, you have to agree to the tenets of anti-racism that include things like all disparities between groups are due exclusively to racism. You can't be a capitalist and an anti-racist, all of these things that you have to agree to. So from the anti-racist perspective, you're either a racist or an anti-racist. They're very clear in saying that there's nothing in between. So you can't be a non-racist who, is conservative, or a non-racist like Daryl Davies, who is like a traditional humanist, right? But anyway, he lays out this 5-step model for how to manipulate therapy clients into the anti-racist point of view. And I've taken a couple of paragraphs that I'd like to read. So here they are. This is from the, early on. And I'm quoting here. The first in-session step of this model is also likely one of the most different for the anti-racist white therapist. In order to maintain our therapeutic stance and to preserve the working relationship, our first task when addressing racism in therapy is simply to listen to the client's story and create a safe holding space where honest feelings can be explored. Although racist worldviews are very difficult to hear without immediately pushing back against, this step is essentially to protect the therapeutic alliance and keep clients engaged before working to increase their racial consciousness.
So take their hand and start walking down the path.
Yeah, make them, and the way that he's using racist, he's not talking about like a Ku Klux Klan person. He's talking about like a traditional liberal person who believes in equality. That to an anti-racist is racist.
Is a racist. Yeah.
Yeah. And so this person starts out by viewing his client as a racist and even describes the animus.
And he's calling the client the racist.
Yeah, well, I don't know if he actually said that, but I think he might have said, like, folks can go and check. I mean, the article's available, but, I don't think he says the racist.
Okay.
But I think he says racist worldviews, which, I mean, it's essentially the same thing.
It's so judgmental. It's so judgmental.
So here's the next stage in the work. This is like after therapy has progressed, after the relationship has been established, so that you can,
so you can influence.
Not going to say this is crazy. Thanks. Right. Now the client is dependent on the relationship. The client, feels safe and is buttered up, right?
Mhm.
This is a pivotal stage for Jeff's work as the therapist attempts to facilitate a connection between Jeff's racial consciousness and his stated goals for therapy.
Mm.
Even though Jeff did not present race as an explicit topic of interest when he came to therapy, by now the therapist has spent time making race a salient topic in therapy and begun to explore how it could have meaning in Jeff's life the ways he hadn't previously been aware of.
Even though he didn't come in talking about race, we have spent time building the groundwork so that we can change how this person
Interject
views
race into it.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
And then here's the final stage. I'm taken from, again, direct quote. Through an intentional process of creating a trusting relationship, introducing the saliency of race in Jeff's life, exploring his racial consciousness, and then connecting race to his stated clinical concerns, the therapist can facilitate a new level of racial consciousness and motivation for growth. Very little or none of this is possible if the white therapist has not done a great deal of their own work so that defensiveness is low and comfort and motivation are high.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
So, and then he goes out, like throughout the article, he talks again and again and again, this author, about this is actually good for the client, for the white client. Like the white client doesn't really know that they need this, but the white client is not. The author also says that all white people are racist, but
so this person has this hypothetical client who's made up as an amalgam of all white clients.
Yeah.
And we know what's best for you, and it's best to connect your presenting concern to race somehow,
right,
and walk you into this racialized discussion and change you to benefit somebody else or some other group of people who are not.
And then to also say that,
how cynical.
The two messages to the client are, you didn't know that you needed this, but I knew that you needed this, and now you're more complete,
Yeah.
And you know where else I hear this? And this is, I was so disturbed. I hear this from clients who have experienced date rape. That what they, not this exact, I hear it on a process level. It's the same message that rapists say to people who have been raped, who they know. And so what they'll say is like, this wasn't for me, this was for you. You didn't know that you needed this, but I know that you needed this. You're now a more fulfilled person because this happens. I hear that story all the time.
Wow.
And
so you see a real
and this is a therapist using the same
techniques,
ideas to say, this is how you do this to your clients in the therapy room.
If that doesn't scare people off therapy.
Well, I'm starting. Okay, so let me talk about the ethics of this. And I know this is long, but there's a lot here to talk about. The American Counseling Association anticipated that there could be clashes between the client's values and the therapist's values. And so they have a very, very strong unambivalent statement, which is it's like section A4 or something like that, where they say that the counselor will not impose their views, their values, their behaviors onto their clients. And essentially and then they say that, essentially they're saying counselors cannot gratify themselves by placing their values on, imposing their values onto someone else. And that can be very gratifying to like control somebody in that way. But they also say, interestingly, like, if you have a need to do that, there's something wrong with you and you should seek therapy. Like,
So,
that's what that section of the ACA Code of Ethics says.
and I know I know the section you're talking about, and something that I keep wondering is how is it reconciled with other parts of the accreditation process? And I believe the ACA's new code that's coming out has that still in it, but also contains more information about cultural competency, which is
Right.
this, it's antithetical to that, but
What,
it takes
yeah,
this whole thing and it sets it outside of the individual counselor, and it says, but this is just goodness. Like
that
this
is
framework is just.
precisely what they've done. So what they've done is, like, to get around this,
Mhm.
like, the ACA is talking out of both sides of its mouth. It's essentially saying that you shall not impose your values on the client unless they're good values. And the way that
Yeah.
they've done that is, and this is truly horrifying, if you look up the social justice or the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies,
Mhm.
if you read between the lines in the competencies, it gives counselors full coverage to break that aspect of the ACA Code of Ethics. It says in there, here are just in looking at the multicultural and social justice competencies, here are the things that you could do in therapy.
Mhm.
You could get clients to view themselves in terms of highly circumscribed composites based on a political ideology, that being privileged and marginalized. Advance a political view in therapy to help clients adopt that view. You could encourage clients to recruit their family members into the view.
What is this? What is this document?
Yeah, this is great. Look it up. We should link to
I
it.
would like a
This is
link.
the Multicultural and Social Justice Counseling Competencies,
Oh
which
my
was
goodness.
approved by the
Oh
American
my
Council of
goodness.
Therapy.
Wow, it's
You
just
can
like it's like saying the quiet part out loud right now.
it is. I couldn't believe this when I read it. You can encourage clients to vote in a way that reinforces the political view.
Oh my goodness. Are you
You can
kidding?
get clients to, here's the winner. You can get clients to change their values to align with far left political views.
This is being, this is actually, this isn't a criticism of this. This is actually what they say themselves.
No, what they say
Oh.
themselves is more nicely. So
Okay,
here's what they say, that counseling competencies, multicultural and social justice competencies are. Here's from the document. Culturally competent counselors assist privileged and marginalized clients to develop critical consciousness by understanding their situation in the context of an oppressive society.
Okay.
So critical consciousness is like
assist them to develop the critical consciousness, which is the system of resentments and indignation that
and level and what's the term? Intersectional identities.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is just weighing yourself against everybody all the time.
Here's another from the same. Assist privileged and marginalized clients in unlearning their privilege and oppression. Okay. So you're going to unlearn your privilege by adopting our, point of view, and you're going to unlearn your oppression by adopting our point of view. Here's a real gem. And again, this is a direct quote. Utilize the norms, values, and regulations of the marginalized client to shape the community norms, values, and regulations of the privileged client. I don't even know what that means, but like that.
Wow, we're going to shape your norms and values. We're going to change.
To shape.
Yes.
You know what?
Wow.
Shaping comes up in the psychological literature.
Thought reform.
Under the use of behavioral mechanisms, including positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. That's how you shape a behavior. And here's the final one that I mean, there's dozens of these, but these are the four that I picked out. Assist privileged and marginalized clients in developing communication skills to discuss issues of power, privilege, and oppression with family, friends, peers, and colleagues. Wow. So we're going to make them into, our social justice puppets.
It just doesn't, none of this resembles therapy whatsoever. This is a complete overtaking of a profession by an ideology.
And
And
I don't,
then
yeah,
it's like turning therapists into like body snatched social justice
yeah.
perpetuators.
And that's, I mean, that's essentially what's happening is
Mhm.
that and it's happening, and this is why I wanted to talk with you, because you've experienced this firsthand.
Mhm.
You know what it's like to be convinced using these powerful manipulations, right?
Mhm.
You
Mhm.
weren't convinced, but you've seen what it looks like
Mhm.
to use these powerful manipulations to be told it's absolutely the right thing to go out and do this. And you can ignore the ACA code of ethics about not imposing your values as long as you're doing it in the name of cultural competence.
Mhm.
So I think the ACA really, really needs to have a moratorium on, anti-racism and counselor education programs. And I
Mhm.
don't know if we quite explained anti-racism as much as we need to, but I will just say here that it is a terrible set of ideas,
Mhm.
as described by Kendi.
It's either
Um,
you're with us or you're against us.
yeah, just and all kinds of
And you need to be
circumscribed.
focused on it all the time.
And you need to, one of the methods that's prescribed to fix social ills is active discrimination. And
Mhm. Mhm.
it's awful, awful
Mhm.
stuff. I
Mhm.
cannot believe that the American School Counseling Association thinks that what that guy has to say would be useful. But there it is, right on the American School
Yeah.
Counseling Association website.
Yeah. And when earlier you said something when I was reading the civility pledge language out about how I don't remember how you phrased it, but you were like, it's not necessarily like there's this little evil group planning this stuff.
No,
But well, what I come back to is where is this originating? Because these
yeah,
DEI trainings, the forced inclusion of all this stuff, it looks the same everywhere
yeah,
that
right,
it's being done. And in situations like this, the reason that it really was so I guess it just made such a stark impression on me in this program was that it stands in such opposition to the other
right,
things that you're being taught. So how can you be sitting in one class and talk about multicultural competencies, knowing what that actually means,
yeah,
and talking about Carl Rogers? Like, how can you do that? And
right,
this is, let's do a paper on Carl Rogers. Make sure you include your
right.
intersectionality assessment.
You're
I
right.
mean,
They are mutually exclusive
mhm,
ideas, absolutely. And you know, counseling as a profession needs to reaffirm
mhm,
that persons in mental distress and children do not exist to gratify the ideological needs of counselors, or by the way, counselor educators. And
mhm,
that is precisely what is allowed under this set of guidelines.
mhm,
You- It's saying, hey, let's use our counseling clients,
mhm,
we know they're vulnerable, but we're doing good things for them. Like we've got the good ideas. So let's go ahead and use them as chess pieces to change society to match our political vision.
mhm, mhm,
And so the ACA really needs to go back and have a moratorium on the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies and say, look, that we made a mistake here.
mhm,
We
mhm,
really need to go back and look at this, look at how authors are talking about this being played out,
mhm,
um, looking at what we are subjecting our students to in trainings. What are we expecting our students to subject their therapy clients to, and to the children? I mean, the American School Counseling Association has recommended Kendi's book. And Kendi, again,
mhm,
he's put out this idea that there are racists and there are anti-racists, and
mhm,
there's nothing
mhm,
in between. And being an anti-racist sounds like a good thing, but in order to do that, you have to, view yourself as either marginalized or oppressed. Um, you have to consider anyone who doesn't hold your views to be racist.
Mhm.
And this is what they're teaching to kids.
Well,
I
they're
mean, this
teaching
is
black and
American
white thinking, which
counselors.
is not,
Sure.
I mean, that's unhealthy thinking. They're teaching you
Terribly
to split.
unhealthy. Terribly, terribly unhealthy thinking.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. Kendi even wrote a book for toddlers that is supposed
Yes.
to be
The
read.
anti-racist baby or
Yeah,
something.
but
Yeah.
guess what one of the steps is? We were talking about the importance of confession earlier because it's
Oh,
sort of it confession both gets a person to get status by confessing. It also makes the ideas to which one is confessing more important.
mhm.
And this, again, for toddlers, Kende is prescribing that toddlers confess their racism. I'm not
What?
kidding. That's like
Oh
step
my gosh.
7 in the book.
How
I-
that doesn't
I-
even make sense. A
I-
toddler.
it's
Wow,
written for toddlers.
that is really, that's kind of
And
heartbreaking, actually, to
it's
hear that that's a thing
extremely
out there, that anybody
heartbreaking.
would think and anybody would endorse such ideas.
Well, so I think like it's a really important time for counselors. Like it's not too late to take a step back, but we have to find the moral courage to do that. And that's going to involve, looking at someone, say an ally who's crying and raving and who's terribly upset and who's, screaming and saying, no, I'm
Mhm.
sorry. I'm sorry you're so upset. And you clearly feel this very deeply, but no, we do not indoctrinate our therapy clients. We just don't do it.
Mhm.
And so, no, sorry,
Mhm.
like we have to find the moral courage to say that.
Mhm.
And, we want to be agreeable. We want to be nice. We want
Mhm.
to be inclusive, but we have to, like, it's time for some straight talk in
Mhm.
the profession about what is going on. It's time for some adults to come into the room.
Mhm. Yeah, very well said. And and I think that picking up on that, I'd love to maybe do a part 2. Could we?
Yeah, I think that's called for, because I think like individual people who are like, we could go into like a little more detail about the rhetoric that is used
Mhm.
and how language is used deceptively and how people tend to get caught into this trap. I think we tried to provide like a
Mhm.
very broad overview today.
Mhm.
I would also just say that, like, I think the ACA has a great opportunity. They've got a really strong statement
Mhm.
about not imposing our views onto our clients. It's
Mhm.
a really good statement. As far as I know, I'm not an expert on the APA
Mhm.
code of ethics, but I don't think that they have something like that. So the
Mhm.
ACA has a really, really good, solid position on this, but they really need to stand behind
They need
it.
to get behind it.
And they really need to understand that diversity, equity, and inclusion and anti-racism and not imposing our values are mutually exclusive. Like,
Mhm. Mhm.
you could like try to find some kind of tortured logic to try to find, but they
Mhm.
just are not. And if you
Mhm.
need any more proof of that, like, go read How to Talk to Your White Clients About Race and look at what's going on, and
Mhm.
then read Merleu's The Rape of the Mind.
Mhm.
So, and if that, absent like a change to go away from the politicization of psychotherapy, we're probably going to have to really look very hard at starting new organizations, not that
Mhm.
are anti-woke. Like, we don't need to sort of go anti-woke or anything like that. But what we do need to do is to have non-political organizations
Yes.
where the what we're researching and what we're talking about in therapy is the result of objective
Mhm.
studies and non-politicized ideas. Uh,
Yes. Yes.
and there is one organization that's doing that now that's kind of exciting. It's the International Association of Psychology and Counseling. And
Okay.
that can kind of be a professional home to people. You don't have to be anti-woke to say, I don't want to be political in therapy. And my hope is that the ACA will say, ooh,
I want in on that.
Maybe like we're really trying to do something good here, but it
Yeah.
didn't work out. We just need to take another look at this. And,
well, hopefully with enough pressure and enough pushback, if we see a shift start to happen, maybe that can.
Yeah, and I think that it's very important that, in the event that they shift, that everyone who's seen this as a problem is gracious about the shift back, like to take sort of the Daryl Davies humanist approach and just say, hey, you know what? Sometimes mistakes really are made, and that's okay. And we're on top of it. We're going to fix it. We're going to get it right. I'm sure that we could do that as a profession, but like, we've really got to look very carefully at the implications. And as they've always said within the profession, have very difficult conversations.
Yeah, and a lot of harms have been done in the name of this. So,
well, it sure sounds that way. I mean, the data on what's actually happening is not there yet. This is a relatively new phenomenon, but if someone were to follow this model of manipulation, what this author is essentially saying is, if you can just push a person's shame button over and over and over again and give them that escape hatch, you can, through negative reinforcement, get them to comply with a political ideology that you favor. And that is pernicious, and that is wrong. And it's okay for the ACA to say that.
And, just going back to what you said about developing an ideologically neutral or objective space for therapy professionals, a new organization, that ties neatly back into what my framework was when I dropped the class refusing to sign the civility pledge. I knew that if I were to post something in objection to the pledge, then I would position myself opposite that. And I didn't want that. I wanted this whole thing to be somewhere in the middle. I wanted us to just be talking about therapy. Let's actually talk about trauma, grief, and loss. I don't want to muck this up and have everything be about how we think about intersection.
Well, and as you and I have discussed, you really do need to understand that people, especially if you live someplace, Burlington, Vermont in general, where I am, has relatively few Black people. Like, people could grow up here and not meet many people who have experienced racism and not be prepared for it. So that it's not that's not an important part of counselor training, but manipulation of vulnerable people and children has no place in the ethical practice
Absolutely.
of psychotherapy. And I don't know if the ACA doesn't look at this. I guess I hope that legislators will. This is dangerous. You do not use psychotherapy for political purposes. You just don't.
I think that is absolutely absolutely true. And I think that's a good place to pause for now. And
speaking of psychotherapy, I think I have
you have a client
coming in. So, Leslie, it was lovely
excellent.
to talk to you. I think we covered like a broad range, and
I think so too.
I really enjoyed speaking with you and hearing your ideas. And people can reach me at kindsvatter.aaron @gmail.com if they want to say hello or whatever. I'm out there. I know it can be like it can feel awfully lonely when when you're seeing these things and you don't like it, and you're walking down the road with somebody and you're looking at like, wow, I'm going to be on the wrong side of a group process here. Or I'm going to be ostracized for not signing the civility pledge or whatever. So it's really important to forge healthy relationships and that do not have conditions of worth applied to them. And then I know you're part of the Solid Ground group, which I can absolutely recommend, as being fantastic.
Yes, yeah, it's a wonderful group. And we look forward to hopefully having you on with us to talk some more about some of these things and some of your experiences as well. And
Okay.
join us.
Well,
And maybe do another round of this too, because I think that there's just so much here to
yeah,
explore.
there
So,
really is a lot to
yeah.
cover. And
yeah.
yeah, so boy, but wow, we really worked here. So hey, thanks a lot, Leslie.
Yeah,
It was
well, it was
wonderful.
absolutely my pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me. And
Okay.
please send me any links that you'd like me to include. This is up now on the live, but I'll go back later and edit the video so that all the links will be underneath for people if they want to follow anything that we've talked about.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think there's some really good things that we could provide them with. So
Okay.
okay, hey, take care.